Hi, I'm Chris Gailus, a proud member of the Vancouver Club, and very pleased to be a part of this project, sharing stories of wartime from members who have family connections to soldiers, enlisted men who lived the war experience. These are their stories. We hope you enjoy it.
I'm Peter Ladner. I'm Tom Ladner's son.
What can you tell us about what Tom told you about his experience?
He didn't talk a lot about it, but there have been books written about it, and I've picked up a lot of stories over the years. The version I got was he and Corny Burke were at Paisley Island, where we still have a family place, and they heard about the war. They were kids, and well, not that young. How old would they have been? Teenagers. And he went off to Osgoode Hall, got his law degree, came back and volunteered, and they were picked to go in the Navy because they sailed around boats around Vancouver. And because he had a degree, he was automatically an officer, which is a bit weird, but he ended up going to England and then to Malta and being a commander and having a very illustrious career. And the experience, harrowing in many ways. But for me, the highlight, if I like the kind of the top line was right here at the Vancouver Club. We had his memorial, and his number 2 guy in the in the ship that he spent most time with, gunboat 663, who was started when he was 19, I think he joined him, came out here and explained that during their entire time in the Mediterranean, they had they were shooting down enemy aircraft. They were shooting. They shot down a bunch of other enemy vessels. They had 99 encounters with the enemy. They didn't have one casualty, not
That's
one
amazing.
Casualty on that boat. And the week after my dad left it to go ashore and have a shore leave or a different job, it hit a mine and went down, and that was the end of it. So they had.
So did he lose crew that he had?
I think some of the
worked
crew
with?
that he had worked with would probably have died in that. But they had he had a sort of a very mysteriously blessed experience in the war, in spite of a lot of hardships, of course. But he came through it alive and worn out, and very decorated. He had all sorts of medals. And
One of the most decorated naval officers in Canada is what I...
Dr. John Blatherwick would have you believe he was the most decorated naval officer, but that's been disputed. So let's just say he had a lot of medals.
Yeah. When you think about this project and recording the legacy of someone like your father, why do you think it's important for younger members, younger people, to be aware of it?
Well, I guess we all stand on the shoulders of all these people who fought these battles on our behalf to get us this, for most of us, or some of us, me anyway, wonderful life that we have. And I think we should respect that and understand what they went through. Here was a 20-something-year-old kid from Vancouver thrown into the path of oncoming bullets and torpedoes and bombs and everything to protect democracy and save the world from Hitler. And that was a pretty bold thing to do. And they went into it thinking this was the right thing to do. We have to do it, a sense of duty, which perhaps people don't have quite as much now, and could learn, I think, a good lesson in that direction from the example of my father and so many others.
Thank you very much for sharing his story.
For sure. I'm Charlsy Dobell, grandson of Owen Charles Dolan, who we're here to talk about today. My mother's Charlsy Dobell, and so I'm joined here by my uncle.
Uncle John Ellis, son-in-law of Owen, married to Sheila Dolan, who was she's the middle sister out of 7. So that's a big family, and his mom is way down there. She's the second from last. So
That's right.
yes, there's lots of families, lots of Dolans around Vancouver, and particularly in the club.
Well, it's exciting to learn a little bit about your granddad and his wartime experience, and and the sacrifice that he made for our country as part of this project. When did you, do you remember when you first became aware of that part of his life and his history?
Yeah, absolutely. It was extremely early on for me, and I'm sure for my cousins as well. Owen made a point of visiting our Remembrance Day ceremonies. And for us in elementary school, I can remember in kindergarten, he would be there. The benefit, of course, was that Remembrance Day often didn't fall on the same day that the elementary schools would celebrate. So he, of course, would always visit the cenotaph ceremony downtown Vancouver here with his fellow veterans. But from a very early age, I can remember him attending in person with his medals at our ceremonies at school and feeling a profound sense of connection with the importance of remembrance for both the Great War and World War II, for which he served.
What can you tell us, and maybe John will bring you in, what can you tell us about his experience? What are some stories that really stood out about what he experienced at wartime?
He said, all I learned was you either salute it or you paint it. And if it moves, you salute it. If it doesn't, you paint it. And so he said, all I did is paint things and say yes or no, sir, for the first couple of years until he got into the real problems when he got into the D-Day situation. Yeah.
Well, and that's a huge part of his experience and of the Canadian wartime experience too. There were all kinds of heroic actions, but there were great casualties too. Did he talk about that and what it was like landing on those beaches? And if so, how did he relate those stories to you?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think to put in perspective for Owen, you have to imagine that he served on corvettes on the HMCS Saskatoon and Camrose, running triangle routes trying to protect the merchant vessels in the North Atlantic from the U-boat peril. He served on those boats for a year. Because of his keen intellect, he was a signalman, so he was responsible for no radio communication, Morse code with the lights between the boats. Those boats were about 200 feet long, terrible to be on. But because of his rank, he had the ability to have a nice cabin. He was close to the top of the ship. And it was in late 1943, he was finished a baseball game and time off in Halifax. He saw a posting on a bulletin board for dangerous duty. And you have to imagine the U-boat peril being so terrible for him that he thought, dangerous duty sounds better than this. And he signed up.
Wow.
They got shipped up immediately to Scotland and then to South England, where they trained. And they didn't know what they were training for. But as a signalman, he was trained as a coxswain, which is somebody who would end up driving the landing craft. He was assigned to the HMCS Prince David, which was a merchant vessel that had been converted for troop carrying. It was one of the largest boats in the Canadian Navy up until the end of the war, which can tell you something about our Navy at the time. Mm-hmm. And he told me in great detail, and John and the rest of the family, about that day and what went on. And of course, history speaks to that. They were the HMCS David was the first boat at anchor for the D-Day operation. They were the first landing craft in the water on that day, and the Canadians were some of the first soldiers on the beach. His boat driving in, it was low tide, high sea. The back, I think it was the aft port side, hit a mine at the top of one of those hedgehogs in the water.
Oh yeah.
Blew up. They lost some sailors there immediately, and they all had to swim to shore. Suffice it to say, the Canadians were the pointy edge of the spear that day and managed to push deep into German-held territory on the beaches. But that was a very harrowing day for him. 50% of the folks that landed on the beach in that first wave did not make it back. Mm-hmm. So yes, and I actually had the opportunity to go to Juno Beach with Grandpa, with John's son Owen,
Yep.
My cousin Andy and Mikey. We were all old enough to join him, and we were there for the 70th anniversary. So that was a profound experience.
Yeah, and an emotional one.
Absolutely. From my recollection, for me, it was the only time I saw my grandfather cry, and it was the first time he'd been back to that beach since that day in June 2004.
You mentioned, I'll go back to it because I missed an opportunity to bring it up. His experience in Greece was so special that he was honored by the Greek community. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
In the late 90s, the local Greek community invited him to a ceremony. He wasn't quite sure.
Wasn't quite sure what it was.
Wasn't quite sure what it was, but the Greek government had created and wanted to give him an award to commemorate his contribution directly to the liberation of Greece. And the difference with the Greek campaign to the other campaigns for him is that he was a little bit of a commando. So he went onshore and was armed and assisted in the liberation of those communities. So it meant a lot to the Greeks.
How gratifying for him too to be
Absolutely.
Yeah, to be
to
recognized.
give that
yeah.
to be recognized for that.
It's very nice. That's
Yeah,
really
yeah.
really show.
Why don't we? This is part of the honor that he received from the Greek community.
Yeah, so this is the article that was written up in the Vancouver Sun and posted in other places about his entire war story and the medal that was awarded to him by the Greek government for his part in the liberation of that country. And we can see at the bottom here all of the medals that he received throughout the war. He was quite a decorated Navyman, seaman.
And this was the ship he served on, and it was just a full crew picture. I guess it was quite common to take it to the shipyard before they took off. But when Owen looks at it, the first thing he does is complains about this guy here. Oh, he was a real jerk lieutenant. I didn't like it. He thought he knew everything. You know, he goes right on into stories about all these people. But that was Owen. He always had a story, and he was usually right about most things. Just had to ask him.
When you think of Owen's experience and the stories that he told and the experience that he lived, and what this project is doing to record that legacy, why do you feel it's important for these stories to be told and shared?
Well, I guess, you know, we're a little older, so I remember the stories from Owen, but a lot of the younger people wouldn't because he was not telling the stories, and he passed away, I don't know how many years ago he passed away, 11 years ago. God, that was quick. But he's just not there to tell the story. So I think it's really important that the project you're doing here is great because it keeps it alive. And very relevant stories. These guys were just, you know, the young guys when they joined, and they went through the club and enjoyed being here all the time. And these people now, I mean, Owen was, they kept it alive. They did the Georgian club consolidation. Marge, Owen's wife, was a head or big member of the Georgian club, and they pushed the two together, and it's going to save both clubs. The same with the club down the street when we merged. Those things really, you know, kept the club alive, keeps it as financially stable as it is today, and has been the last bunch of years, got through all this mess, COVID, but we were well financed, and we had good membership, and we had dedicated people. And Owen was one of those guys that was a leader in that, as some people like Dick know very well, that there's a core of guys that kept things going. And I think it's really important that they understand Owen's story, where he got his get-go from. He was as happy as hell to make it back to Canada at the end of it all, and then create a life over here for himself and get his law degree and go through and have a very successful life here in Vancouver and have a big family, very large family. So I think he's very happy all that happened because he knows it was this close so many times.
Yeah, that gratitude can be a powerful motivator.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And sort of the leadership that he showed back in wartime and sense of duty really made an impact on what he accomplished back here in Vancouver.
He never stopped. He was as magnetic as he was always pushing, both his family and others, and he was always right. And there's a quote from the Law Review in the Law Society obituary that they wrote up. A good friend of his wrote up a nice essay after he passed away, and they say that, you know, they often argued about right and wrong, and Owen was often right at the end of the day. And I think that's because of you know, how his moral compass was forged during that war, and, you know, what mattered. I think for me, Chris, the most important thing is, as I get older, I realize how close those wars are to us, and how similar the circumstance that led to the outbreak of global war is to what we see today. And I think we're at the risk of repeating it if we don't tell these stories and remind people that freedom is something that's earned and fought for every day. It's not a gift.
It's a great way to end it.
Yeah, it's a good point, Charles.
Thanks, Charlsy.
Great.
Thanks very much, John. I appreciate it. Thanks for sharing your story and sharing Owen.
Pleased to do it.
Appreciate it.
Great job.
Great.
Thank you very
Chris.
much.
Thanks for your time.
I'm Cecil Merritt, and my father is Cecil Merritt. My grandfather has Cecil Mack Merritt.
First, I want to talk a little bit about your dad, who had wartime experience that a lot of people will be impressed by. What do you remember? What's your earliest memory of learning about what your dad's experience was in the war?
I would say when he returned from overseas, we were in Belleville, Ontario, and I'd be 6.5 years of age. So the first thing I remember is a massive parade for my father in Belleville. And that's the first thing I remember.
What did your dad relate about his experience? Was he forthcoming about his wartime experience?
He didn't care to talk about it too much because, as he said, I only spent 1 day at war and years of training, because he was captured by the Germans at Dieppe, after the Dieppe landing. But all he could relate to was the boredom of training in England. He went over in September of 1939, and the Dieppe raid isn't until August of 42, but all the Canadian soldiers have been going marching up and down and up and down and up and down until they're fed up with it. And they were willing to go to war under any circumstances.
It wasn't a choice for him.
No.
It was absolutely, I'm going to sign up.
It was duty, so they signed up.
And that rubbed off on you, because it sounds like you had a strong sense of duty to contribute in that way.
I did. You can't get rid of it, your environment. you have it.
Yeah. And so that lesson, or that sense of duty that was handed down to you from your father, you ran with that and you joined
Yep.
the Seaforth Highlanders. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I thought it was useful, and it kept me from doing other things. So as a kid, you were paraded 2 nights a week. You couldn't get in any trouble. You had to spend the other days cleaning your uniform or shining your belts, and it was infantry, so you knew that you were going to, if a war came along, they taught you how to shoot a gun. We went to the Blair Ranges, then I went to the summer Vernon cadet camps. But I think I did everything out of duty. I just, I can't tell you I was smart. It was duty that drove you.
And when you see or think about Canada's war readiness today, maybe lack of similar experience that a younger generation has, whether it's through cadets or other experiences like that, what are your thoughts on that?
My own thought is that we're in a deep spiral downwards, and I don't think people are prepared to fight for freedom. I think we take too many things for granted. And I think I shared with you earlier, I don't think that many people ever signed up in any war. 5% of Canadia's population will sign up and do something. The others don't. And but we might be lucky to get 2% if we don't even have that sense of duty. So that would be my reaction to it.
Part of the reason for this project is so that a younger generation of club member and beyond can learn about the sacrifices and duty of that generation. When it comes to sharing stories about your father and your own military experience, what are your thoughts about the importance of a project like this and sharing those stories?
It's terribly important, and I wish the program well. It's very difficult to see how to make it work, but it has to be history, and it has to be the success of history. There's no point talking about failures. So let's talk about the things that were successful and the kind of life you can live here because of those freedoms. They didn't come without a cost, but I think that freedom has to be, you can't shovel freedom at somebody. They have to find out that that is very good. And so they have to want it. And if they see it in the previous generations, the leaders, that rubs off on people. As my little efforts, they rubbed off on me. So I think you have to have success. It has to be taught, and history has to be drummed daily into people until it's part of their makeup. So I hear it from others. So I did go over to Dieppe a year ago September for a convocation in Dieppe. And the mayor of Pourville they've dedicated a bridge to my father. It had been dedicated, but they wanted to rebuild it. So all I can clearly see is there's a bridge is over the river Sea, S-C-I-E, and when you see those concrete emplacements with a machine gun fire coming down, it's the South Saskatchewan Regiment, and prairie farmer guys are the best soldiers. So these
Tough guys.
Tough guys, and guys are dying. And so anyway, he waved his helmet and took 4 groups across that bridge.
Taking fire.
Taking fire all the time, but he was lucky, and but they did finally get rid of one of those pillboxes. So the guys that went up that hill, even after that hail of fire on the bridge is down at sea level, and that's 300 feet of cliff you have to get up. But they got rid of one pillbox, and then they realized that, and it's called a raid in force. There was no intention of us staying there. The Canadians' job was to test the defenses of Europe and find out how good they were or not. So I think the raid, in my sense, was worthwhile to establish what works and what doesn't work. Because these young men haven't served in another war and landed on another beach. It's not as if we've done it before.
Right.
So I think that, from my point of view, that raid was worthwhile. And then my father had been shot through. You should see the holes where at the entrance, the bullet holes go through. How they missed his heart, I don't know. And the big scars on his back where the bullets exit. So for his ability to keep functioning with what I call serious wounds, I always found surprising. They never talked about it. I just know when he was having a shower, we were going swimming or something, you can see those bloody wounds. I never talked about it.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
I think that the other thing was that I'm going to say one more thing about leadership. If you're a leader, you have to be decisive, but we try and grow up our kids to be decisive, because it's awful if you can't make a decision. So these men have to make a decision, and I think that the decisive people save lives. Because if you were kind of in a quandary as to what to do when you're on that bridge or doing any other thing, you're going to lose a lot more men. So the only thing you can do, I think the expression, mine is not the reason why, mine is but to do or die, makes sense in one sense. Because there'd be fewer deaths if you just get the job over with. And hesitation is a killer. So I think that when you, so if we train people to be decisive and reward the decisiveness in whatever way you can, so that you don't have to apologize for your decisions, we'd be much more effective. And I think in my father's case, people were gratified because they had somebody who made decisions, and they could see that it had to save lives, because you could see the alternative.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good policy in wartime and in business.
And business, because my own experience is people would always say, "You're going to fix this company? How the hell are you going to do that?" And you start at it, and you have to walk your talk, and the truth. You got to be honest, and you got to get customers come back. But everybody at the beginning don't like the shock of that, but they always thank you at the end. But I learned that from my father. I didn't figure that out until I did it.
That's a hell of a lesson.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Anyway, my dad never bragged. I'm more of a braggart than my father is, by far. And so I just, all I can say is, I was a lucky kid. I got good training.
That is amazing that your father lived through a scenario that we have seen Hollywood movies about. We have seen The Great Escape and the, you know, just incredible drama, and yet he was still able to come back here with all of the emotional baggage that would have come from that and be able to lead such a productive, giving life.
It's amazing. I mean, I'm always more emotional. My father didn't show that. But I'll tell you one more story which I think is fascinating. As a member of Parliament, he's in Ottawa, and it's right after the war, and everybody's worried. Everybody in Parliament's all worried about the fact that the Japanese people were moved to the Vernon area for safety reasons during the war. He said, I just learned one thing, Cecil, no one cares a damn in Parliament about all the people who died. The whole blather is about how we treated people here in Canada that didn't serve. And that stuck in my craw right from the beginning. So he said, I could only serve 4 years, to heck with it, and short of a revolution, bringing about change in Canada is going to be brutal. And I always remember that.
I think maybe he was right about that too.
So those kind of things, I sure remember that stuff.
Yeah, fascinating.
But it rings true to me today. It's not, I don't disavow it. It's clear that he was right from my point of view. So, that's the kind of stuff.
Great stories, and I know it hits you in the heart.
Yeah, it does. But I do think Canada is worthwhile saving. I don't like the people that say better red than dead. That really I find deplorable. So I'm hoping that we do foster a country of people who want to make things happen and for the good of our own people. You know, that's the notion. So, yeah.
Cecil, thank you very much again.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
Okay.
I know it wasn't always easy, but it was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
My name is Chris Hoffmeister. I'm a Vancouverite, and I'm the very proud grandson of Major General Bert Hoffmeister.
He did a lot of things in his long life, a lot of great things. Maybe talk a little bit about the connection to Vancouver Club, first of all, and how his legacy lives on here.
Yeah, my earliest memories of my grandfather, as ironic as it is, was cleaning his guns. He took fastidious care of his firearms, and those are the same firearms that are on the 4th floor at the Vancouver Club.
So this is a collection that he amassed over years, or
It wasn't really a collection. He wasn't a passionate gun collector or anything. These were relics from the Second World War, from the campaign through Italy, and then into Holland, as well as his personal firearm. He was a big John Wayne fan.
Oh yeah.
So the gun upstairs was very akin to John Wayne's firearm.
That's great. What were some of your earliest memories of learning about his service and what he did for our country?
Yeah, it was. We knew. I think as a really young kid, and I've got to say I was so lucky. I knew my grandfather so well, and we really only knew how relevant he was towards Canadian military history when Remembrance Day would come around, and I would remember the military car coming to get my grandfather, and then there's a 2-star license plate placard that's upstairs, and that would get affixed to the front of that car, and my grandfather would head down and be one of the sort of more prominent figures at Remembrance Day. You know, war, to say it mildly, is tough. It's hard. It's hard on anyone's mind, and I don't think the emotional, mental health outreach was there in place for people like my grandfather after the war. So he didn't really talk a lot about it. It was quite repressed. And frankly speaking, my grandfather, while a fantastic leader during the Second World War, was as much of a fantastic leader outside of the war. You know, he was he isn't defined as being a soldier. He's defined as being a great Canadian. And yeah, that's what I learned. But you know, in terms of the stories, they would come up. One thing I learned about my grandfather, which I thought was fascinating, and it was sort of reiterated at his funeral, was he would tell me stories about going to do his own reconnaissance. He really felt strongly that he would never put another soldier in harm's way if he wasn't prepared to be put into the same risk, put at the same risk. And he would, I think back then they would use a cabling system so they could cable back intelligence back to the company. And he would run, and we're talking 20, 30 kilometers a day through the battlefield, sometimes way behind enemy lines.
This is rugged territory
Very
too.
rugged. You know, my grandfather as a young man in the city was a rower. He had a boat at VRC. He was a rugby player. He was fit for that kind of job. And he was well known, and it was obvious from the way he spoke about his time in the military. He was well known to be very much a soldier's general. He was very much up in front with the fighting force and making sure that the field of battle was well known to him, so they were making the right moves and were not going to be faced with as many surprises as they would have otherwise been. His father got injured, I think, at a young, well, my grandfather was quite young, and so I think my grandfather left Kits High, where he went to Kitsilano High School. He went to Henry Hudson, I should add, too, as well as for elementary, and started working in a sawmill. And then he joined as a cadet when he was 12, and then as in 39, he went off to do officer training in Kingston, Ontario, and then in England, and then went to war in 1943 is when he landed on the shores of Sicily. After the war, after the Japanese surrender, my grandfather came back to the city and he became president of Macmillan Bodell. And he had worked originally for H.R. Macmillan, I believe, just before the war. So H.R. knew him. And of course, my grandfather at that point had become quite a military leader and was tapped with the responsibility of leading one of the largest forest products businesses in the world. And back to his own values of reconnaissance and really understanding what's happening in the field of battle, he was well known for cruising timber, which meant going in looking at the quality of timber. He loved to be outdoors and didn't manage that company from a corner office. He managed the company from the field.
He's picking the trees that he thinks are going to...
He would go look at the high quality of trees
Yeah.
and try and understand what the... I think at that time he started to understand very much the environmental impact. He eventually, after he left Macmillan Bodell, he went to become the head of COFI, the Council of Forest Industries. At one point or another, he ended up in England, working as Agent General, British Columbia, as well. And then he found a very profound calling, which was the Nature Trust of British Columbia. I have a real job, but I have another calling, which is chair of the Patrons Corps, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. The Seaforths are my grandfather's regiment. It's the one he joined up with when he was 12 years old. And as chair of the Patrons Corps, our mission is to really ensure the legacy of Canadian military history and the Seaforths specifically, and to try and share the history with generations to come. And we've established an extraordinary museum at the Seaforth Armory on Burrard Street, which really memorializes and is that legacy establishment of the Seaforth Highlanders and Canadian military courage and valor. It's something that we should all, anyone in Vancouver, should really try and take an opportunity to go see and view. The museum's extraordinary, and the hard work of a lot of people, my father particularly, and a number of other people in the Seaforths have done an extraordinary amount of work to make sure that museum is something special.
And I can imagine there's a good display of Bert Hoffmeister's accomplishments.
Yeah, but it's not just Bert. You're right, Chris. There's a lot of Bert in the building, no question. But there's a lot of other incredible people. You know, Bell-Irving, Smokey Smith. You know, just something about Vancouver. We bred really strong and courageous soldiers. And I think one of the things that I always think about when I'm in that building is, you know, very young men and young women going to war in '39 from this city. They all knew each other. You know, when someone died in the field of battle in Italy, my grandfather wasn't just writing a letter back to that family. He was writing a letter back to a mother and father who he knew. He could have had, you know, cookies and apple pie from, you know, out of their kitchen as a young man. That's powerful. And I don't want anyone, what's really important is that people understand the legacy and people understand the commitment and the service other people have done for them so we can have what we've got today.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that's why we're doing this project, to preserve those memories. If there's if there's a couple of sentences or a phrase that reminds you or crystallizes what your grandfather means to you, how would you describe it? What would you say?
Yeah, it's a contrast between, well, it's not a contrast, it's really just resilience and love. My grandfather was genuinely interested, engaged in all those around him. He was an amazing grandfather, a fantastic father, and but he was, you know, resilient to the end. I have other early memories. My grandfather was an amateur beachcomber.
Oh, wow.
I'm talking at like the age of 70-something. My grandfather was rowing the shores of West Vancouver, putting his hammer stamp on logs, dragging those logs in a rowboat back to his beach in West Van, and bucking up the wood. You know,
wow.
Resilient to the end.
Tough.
And so the thing that sits with me and the thing I tell myself a lot is when things are challenging, I think back to my grandfather walking through Sicily in 35-degree heat in the middle of summer on very rugged terrain with a backpack and a responsibility. And so I lean on that a lot in my own life to make sure that I don't get overwhelmed by my own situation. When I think back to what he was dealing with and eventually 20,000 members in his division, it's the responsibilities I have and most of us have today don't even compare to what people like my grandfather did back in the war.
Well, it's great to learn about Bert and appreciate you sharing stories with us. Thank you very much, Chris.
You're very
Really
welcome.
appreciate you
Thank you for the
sharing
opportunity.
stories with us.
Yeah,
That's
my
great.
pleasure.
My name is Doug Jevning. I'm a past president of the club and was a friend of Rod Smith's during my early tenure in the club and his later tenure in the club.
Maybe what was your first impression of meeting him, if you want to go back to that moment where you first learned about what kind of man he was?
Rod was a tall, austere-looking fellow, reminiscent of an elegant eagle type of man. Few words, but well chosen, is the way I would put him. Didn't speak a lot about the war, but didn't have any difficulty talking about it if it was brought up or if he was asked something. And that was sort of the habit of most of his friends and mine here at the club who had served our country. Yeah.
You describe him as tall, which is unusual for a fighter pilot, but that was how he contributed. What are some of the stories that you remember hearing about his service?
Well, he told me some things, and he's the subject, been the subject of a book as well. So Rod was born in Regina, a flatlander, and loved airplanes from a young age. Enlisted in 1940 at 18, just as soon as he could, and embarked to England and began flying Spitfires, mostly in the beginning covering Dunkirk and in the Calais area, and then later in Malta, and then later in the later stages of the war, protecting bombers and attacks over Germany and Belgium.
Brave work. That was very, very dangerous, and Canada lost a lot of men in the sky.
Yeah, they did. And in fact, when Rod was posted to Malta in 1942, unexpectedly, his brother Jerry was a member of the same squadron. And when Rod got to Malta, Jerry was already there. So it was nice for Rod and Jerry to fly together. They flew as wingmen together for quite a long time, had a shared downing of a Junkers 88 fighter bomber. And then unfortunately, Jerry was shot down in Malta and presumed killed in action while they were both there.
Rod had a great deal of success as a fighter pilot. He was an ace.
He was an ace. He shot down 16 aircraft, 4 or 5 Junkers bombers, a number of Messerschmitt 109s, a couple of Italian fighter planes, and sort of, I suppose, most memorably, he had a third kill of the first enemy jet fighter plane in a Messerschmitt 262 in 1944.
Wow.
Yeah.
For a guy flying a Spitfire, that must have been a...
Yeah, they were pretty good planes.
Yeah, they were good planes,
Yeah.
you're right. And when he was part of the group of guys that would get together here at Vancouver Club, did he share stories or did...
Yeah, and I would come for lunch, and Rod came daily and would sit at the common table in Bar 3 with a group of old codgers, I'd call them at the time, who were successful businessmen, many of whom had fought in the war, at least one of whom you've had an interview about, Owen Dolan.
Oh, yeah.
And a group of these fellows used to sit around the round table at lunch, and I'd come in and they'd invite me to sit with them if I was alone. And, you know, they were an intimidating lot for a young fellow. And they would talk if you asked. And if conversation sort of lagged a bit, I could always turn to Rod or one of the others and then just simply say, and then what happened? And, you know,
You'd get some gold.
Yeah, you'd get some good story.
Why is it important for you to be a part of it and to keep that legacy and memories of what Rod did alive?
Well, a group of us several years ago for Remembrance Day started talking about having some sort of a display or some sort of indication of staff members and members of the club who had served and died and you know, made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. And it started really to grow from there a little bit. I had begun what is now a tradition of the club on Remembrance Day. And a fellow who was a past president of the club, as am I, wasn't able to make it to the Remembrance Day ceremonies at the cenotaph, so his name was Peter Stanley. And I invited Peter, I said, well, why don't we just go down and we'll have somebody put up a television at the club and we'll watch it from the club. Mm-hmm. And Philip Ireland sort of made that happen. Mm-hmm. And then the next year he brought us sandwiches. And the next year he opened a little bar and 3 or 4 of us came. And now it's grown to be a full lunch and there's probably 60 or 70 people there. And
wow.
Yeah, so it began organically with Peter Stanley and myself and has grown to be now a traditional club event. So that sort of feeling of service and of remembrance of our veterans has always been with me. another past president, Dick Richards, whose impetus has brought all this together, was always part of what can we do to honor our veterans, and was part of the group that began thinking about this display. And then Dick came up with this idea, and he asked me about who did the club have that were war heroes or had just served, really, and they're all heroes, but had served. And we started thinking about names, and Rod came immediately to mind to both of us. And it sort of fell to me as, you know, I didn't know him as well as some of his old contemporaries, not mine, but most of them are sadly no longer with us. Yeah.
And he sounds like he's a good example of somebody who sacrificed and did what needed to be done in wartime and turned that into a productive, giving life back.
And those sorts of things, yeah.
Well, we're glad to share his story and include him in this group of veterans.
So Jerry was an accomplished pilot, obviously, as were all Spitfire pilots. But he was the first airman to actually land a Spitfire on an aircraft carrier.
Wow.
And Spitfires aren't meant to land on aircraft carriers. They don't have a hook under the underbelly of it. They don't have anything really to do it, but he put it down on the deck and landed it without crashing, which was, you know, quite a feat.
That would have been a hell of an accomplishment
Oh, yeah.
back then. And
Can you
to be the
imagine?
first to do it, I mean,
Yeah.
you're trying something that hadn't been done before.
I'm not sure how many other people did it either. I don't think it was something that was sort of encouraged.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's Jerry, Rod's brother.
Rod's
who
brother,
did it.
yeah.
Well, that's
Yeah.
a proud moment. That was a proud brother moment.
It was, and he was very proud of that. Well, and very proud of his brother, period, but very much proud that that sort of thing was able to be done, I suppose, during a pretty intense period of fighting in the Mediterranean.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad that you're here to help
Yeah, I'm
share
happy to
those
do it.
stories. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Doug. We really appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Roderick Bell-Irving, the only member of my family that doesn't have a middle name. The son of the second son of three of my parents, Budge and Nancy Bell-Irving.
And we're here to talk about Henry Budge Bell-Irving and his service.
Henry Pybus Budge Bell-Irving.
Henry Pybus Budge Bell-Irving.
My father.
Obviously, you must have been aware growing up about his service. You ended up with the Seaforth Highlanders as well. What are your earliest memories of either knowing about his service or the military? Maybe take us back to your first memories of that.
Well, my first memories were not obviously in the war, because I was born right after the war. I'm one of those. And so I don't have any firsthand knowledge of that. But I grew up as a member of a very large family, all of whom have served in all branches of the military. And so I began to appreciate the connection between the privileged life we were living and service in the military by my family. And I'd have to say, throughout my entire life, I've been exposed to service in the military, and my father's in particular. He, like many of his fellow soldiers, never spoke about the war. He wouldn't share any of the details. He never talked about it in any way, shape, or form. But he was fiercely proud of it, obviously, and also surrounded by comrades through the regimental connections. And so I grew up getting to know General Hoffmeister, getting to know all of the Smoky Smith, VC, members of the regiment who've served their country with distinction. And it's through them vicariously that I hear about my father. Eventually, though, in my life, it turned out in 1980, and I was in my mid-30s at the time, I was in Amsterdam, of all places, on the heels of Canada's decision to boycott the Munich Olympics. And I happened to have been the national rowing coach in 1980. And I took a team to Holland as a consolation prize. And while I was there, as soon as I arrived at the hotel, I was confronted by the hotel manager who gave me a stack of photos like that high and said, "You got to look at these." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, just have a look." And what I was shown was a series of photographs that were taken just 2 weeks prior to my arrival of the Canadians, in this case the Sea Force, who had just gone through the 35th anniversary of the liberation of Holland in a parade. And these were pictures of the city and the streets lined 10, 12 deep of people, and the Sea Force, many of which I knew at that time, in the vehicles being celebrated and being honored as they were coming through Amsterdam. And I was struck by the fact that the ages on the faces of those people, most of them weren't even born at the time of the war. And so there had to be something very special. And he got to the very end of this stack of pictures, and he saved the very end. Here was this picture of this old pompous looking guy at the front of the thing, waving as he came into Dam Square. And he pointed and he said, "Do you know who that is?" And I said, "Yeah, that's my dad."
Wow.
So, you know, it doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah.
It brings home, and that impact, that moment, that relationship has stuck with me for the rest of my life. I had the privilege of commanding the Sea Force later on in the early 90s. We attached a very close relationship with the Dutch community, and to this day, I appreciate and respect the degree to which the Dutch people, the Netherlands, honor Canadians, honor, yes, my father, but honor the service soldiers. Again, just last year, I took the Sea Force on a battlefield tour of Sicily, Italy, to trace the steps of the 1943 Operation Husky, the Canadians landing their first foray into the war. And Father was a company commander at the time. And I had the privilege of being able to walk in his footsteps, actually walk the ground, the beaches on which he landed, the place where he got his Distinguished Service Order, where Smokey Smith won his VC. And I, as a retired colonel, was given the privilege of reading the orders that Dad gave to the regiment in 1943 and in the exact same spot he gave them. Now, what are the odds of that happening? Those are the sort of pieces that I remember about the connection, and it's through that, through these other people, through these experiences, that I really now fully understand and have a sense of his service.
Yeah, and that is, you know, helping keep the legacy alive in a very real.
Well, that's what we're
tangible way.
doing, and Chris may have mentioned this, but we're planning another tour next year as a regiment to take the regiment over to Holland, because it's the 80th anniversary. It's probably the last time there'll be a significant honoring and acknowledgement. And we've proven that by taking today's soldiers over there, walking the ground, visualizing in place, in person, the ground, the circumstances, that's how we're able to honor and continue the memory and the legacy.
Yeah.
So we continue to do that sort of thing.
I think it's great too that, you know, you were able to go back to Italy. I think maybe Canadians' impressions of World War II, when they think of the major battles that happened on sort of the western coast of Europe, Dieppe and Normandy, and some of the other more publicized battles. But to get boots on the ground in that conflict in Italy is maybe less well known, but they were just as heroic in their actions.
Absolutely, and again, one's reminded of that today by being back there as recently as last May and June, where 85, 90-year-old citizens, Italians who were 5 and 6 at the time, sought out our regiment, our tour group, and made a point of sharing with us the impact that the Canadians, liberation, the relief of the Germans had on their family, on them personally. It really takes on a burden. I mean, it gives you a sense that we must continue to tell that story. We must continue to, as I say, move forward looking back. Because it's that looking back and understanding and appreciating that.
Do you think it's just as important for people to know the military experience, the commitment to country, and the bravery and leadership that they exhibit there? It's just as important for us to know that as it is to know what they contributed when they came back to civilian life, and for people, a newer generation, to understand that connection and commitment to community?
Well, I like to think that's important. I'd like to think it's critical, but I'm a bit of a skeptic to think that today's, and I've got grandchildren who I'm encouraged by, 19 years old, encouraged by their enthusiasm and interest, but if you look generally, I'm not connected enough with today's youth to know if there's what challenges we're facing. But yes, by all means, we need to have them understand the people and the circumstances and the facts around which they rose and served. If they can keep that foremost in their mind, then shape how they interpret that and apply it today, then that's the best we can do.
How do you think your dad would view this project that we're doing? You and some of his contemporaries, and people connected to your dad and his service and to the Armory. How do you think he'd view this project, sharing stories?
He would be championing it, but quietly behind the scenes, supporting it. It's the right thing to do, and that's the extent to which I think he would think about it. He would smile somewhat when he looks at the people you're interviewing and the people that are being represented here. And he's saying, well, what's strange, they're all family. Malcolm, cousin, Chris Hoffmeister, Bert Hoffmeister, I mean, not lineal family, but we're all from the same cloth. That's part of Vancouver, it's part of the history.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, yeah.
Okay, Malcolm, first things first, just introduce yourself for us.
Yes, Malcolm Burke. I'm the eldest of 5 children, son of Corny Burke, who's the subject of our interview today, and longtime resident in Greater Vancouver area, and a member of this club, which was very important to him.
Take us back to when you first became aware of your dad's service and what that was like. What was the sort of context of that?
Well, the background is sort of interesting because my father was reservist with the Canadian Navy and sent with 2 colleagues to join the Royal Navy. And my mother accompanied him, pregnant with her first child, who happened to be me.
Wow.
So I went to the UK with my father and my mother, initially inside my mother, of course.
And then were you born there?
And my father was based in Lowestoft on the English Channel, which was subject to a German bombing rate, fighter escort machine gun attacks. So my mother went up to Scotland, to Edinburgh, where she had relatives, also a member of the Bell-Irving family, Rob's family, and I was born in Scotland. Left the UK at 18 months of age, no memories, subsequent stories, and our family ended up in Victoria. And my earliest memory and knowledge of the war was probably at 2.5 years of age in Victoria, because there was a great deal of conversation about what was going on, what was happening on almost a daily basis by the occupants of the house that we were living in.
Wow. What do you know about your dad's service, and are there any stories that jump out at you that demonstrate his contributions in wartime?
Well, he became quite a well-known figure because he and two of his colleagues, reasonably well-known Vancouverites, Thomas Ladner and Doug Maitland, the three of them went and became fairly well-renowned and talked about as the Three Musketeers. And originally based on motor torpedo boats in the English Channel, but later moved to Malta on a slightly larger ship called an MGB, motor gunboat, where they spent the vast majority of the war harassing enemy shipping in the Adriatic and the Mediterranean.
He had a couple of lucky scrapes in that conflict.
He did. He was, I was very interested, had heard so much, even at a very young age, about the war. In my 3-year-old mind, I was trying to figure out what the war really was and exactly how it functioned. So his arrival home in Victoria when I was about 4 years of age was much anticipated by everybody in the house and myself.
Mm-hmm.
And
What was that moment like when he came? Do you remember when he came home?
Very clearly. My aunt walked us up the road. We were at the corner of Cabra Bay Road in the Oak Bay area, and to meet this car that was driving my father, who was just an image in my mind at that point, and bringing him home. And my mother had gone to meet him in Halifax and accompany him back across the country. So I was overwhelmed by the anticipation and the fact of his arrival.
What was it like when you saw him?
Well, he was larger than life in every sense, and I was full of questions, but had a hard time verbalizing. I was, but quickly became, the strengths of his personality were such that he was very easy to listen to and talk to, and so from that point forward, I pestered him with questions, and he gave me measured answers which he thought were suitable for a 4-year-old boy. But beyond that, I learned a lot of his experience and remember it very clearly to this day.
What were some of the stories he told you when later on when it was a conversation between men? Do you remember how he was impacted, and what were some of the stories that really stuck out to him?
Well, his initial decision, well, it wasn't so, I think everyone was prepared to go to war in his cohort. And I think it started off as a bit of an adventure. There was an adventure aspect to it. It was for the right reason, but there was a bit of an adventure to it. But the reality and the adventure soon became one. And he said, what you don't realize at the time is you're sort of commanding men and boats at 23 years of age.
That's almost hard to comprehend for a lot of 23-year-olds today, which is why we're doing this, so they can understand what those responsibilities were, I guess. So that is a huge responsibility.
It is, and I don't know where the maturity, I was always speculating on how fast you had to become something completely different from the person you were when you first arrived. And I think the acceleration of learning and experience was something he never forgot. And my memory is that the memories of those events and at that time made him the person he ultimately turned out to be. It was a huge factor in his life. And the camaraderie was lifelong, and the reunions were lifelong, which spoke more than anything about how the impact of those days and those years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the relationships that you make bonded in conflict, I think, are, even though I've never experienced it, but you can understand how they share something that probably nobody else can comprehend, especially when you're taking fire or your boat's burning down or all the other things that he lived through.
Yes, and I think my father probably came back and he viewed the world, the peacetime post-war world, in a manner that he recognized that my generation, free from war, free from the experience, was missing something in the sense that this was a life-threatening conflict, civilization changing personally, that he'd experienced at a young age, and it had impacted him, and he recognized that my generation would never experience that.
The element of adventure that informed his decision to join up and go, and then also in later years he started a travel agency, so there's a little bit of adventure in that too. Obviously he must have felt that in some way.
Well, I think the travel agency was sort of the end. He came back and went into the towboat business.
Wow, okay.
And the boating and the marine life was very much in his blood. And he got into the tugboat business, and the tugboat business did quite well. And that's where he was. That was his passion. The travel industry was a casual investment that he, as Tom Ladner, his partner, said, I wouldn't trust him to book me to Victoria.
Well, it ended up being a success anyway.
Yeah.
But that's interesting that, obviously he's taking expertise as a 20-something running gunships in the English Channel. You're obviously very comfortable on the water and was able to turn that into a successful business and career back here. And you can't do that without great leadership qualities. And you talk about the maturity that had to come very quickly for an enlisted person back then when you're kind of commanding a crew of a gunboat. Did you see those kinds of leadership qualities in your father?
I did.
Back here? Yeah.
I did, and I had the advantage because his executive officer, who was a British a Brit, Rover Reynolds, wrote a book called Gunboat 658, which I read at a very young age, and he related in the book what it was about my father's personality that made him a good leader, and those were qualities that I could see as a son. Mm-hmm. And it was his sense of humor, his ability to attract people. He had a strong personality, and people wanted to be in his presence. And he was a leader, but not a boss. He did have a very funny story.
Oh yeah, let's hear that one.
And this was involved another member of this club. The Seaforths were in North Africa, trying to get rid of Rommel. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of Canadians from Vancouver. And my father and a couple of other boats were escorting supplies to a pier in North Africa where they found, by coincidence, that here were these guys they knew from Vancouver who were the Seaforths. And here he was, part of the British Navy, but Canadians. So they found out that one of the leaders of the Seaforth, or was a guy from Vancouver. Milt Owen was his name, Walter Owen's brother, who became the lieutenant governor here. Oh, wow. And they came on board out to the end of the pier. And I'm not sure how far I can go with this story, but they came on board, and then of course in British ships in the officers' quarters you could drink. There was alcohol. There was no alcohol in the Seaforths.
Brits knew how to do it, didn't they? The Brits knew what they were doing.
So the Seaforths, these three friends came on board and consumed a lot of alcohol, and then we're very curious about the ship and the armaments and what it could do. And at some point a torpedo was launched and it took out part of the pier.
Oh.
So my father...
Really? Did your dad tell that story, or did
my
you
father
hear
tells it,
secondhand?
and how much, how close to the actual facts it is, I don't know. But he said that he had to write up this report. Anytime anything was fired during a wartime, he had to write up it and explain it.
And that would have been a tough letter to write, I'm sure.
So he had to write a report that And I never saw the report, but he had several versions of it, which all quite amusing.
That's a great story. That's a great story. Well, thank you, Malcolm, for sharing your father with us and some of those stories. And it's going to be a great part of this project.
Well, I'm delighted to see this take place. It's a great initiative because, to my earlier comment, my father was concerned about fading memories, and I think I feel the same way. And so anything that can help keep those very valuable memories alive, I think is important.
First off, I'll get you guys to introduce yourself. Jeff, I'll start with you.
Great. Jeff Bell. I live in Steveston and grandson of Ian Bell.
Okay. Go ahead.
And Bruce Bell, son, one of 4 children.
Or where are you in the
Number
lineage?
2.
You're number 2.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're here to talk a little bit about Ian Hunter Bell and his service to our country. And having just learned that a lot of the history you guys learned even after he passed. But let's start with, what was his role in wartime?
Well, he was a commander of his own ship, the Alberni, youngest in the Royal Canadian Navy. And I think he was in that position for a couple of years, 42 to 44, 1944, when they were torpedoed. So that was his length of service, but then he got started earlier than that even.
What was his earliest introduction to sort of wartime training?
Well, a cadet at Discovery in Stanley Park, and after he got out of high school, he was a cabin boy on the Empress of Japan. He always had a nautical interest, and then he started articling with his dad. That's where he ended up. His father was a CA as well, so he was starting that, and then along came the war. He's a cadet, and all of a sudden, there's your boat.
Yeah, and amazing. That's one of the things we've talked about in some of the interviews, is how quickly these young men had to be leaders of other men.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you got to know your father well enough to know that probably didn't surprise you, but being a leader, not just in wartime, but also in civilian life.
Oh yeah, it just carried on.
Yeah. What did you learn about that fateful day when the Alberni was torpedoed, and how your father dealt with that? What do you know about it?
Well, it's mostly from reading about it rather than from him. Mm-hmm. He didn't talk much, which I understand is quite normal for guys of his generation and that experience. But they were torpedoed in the English Channel, and it was noon, so everybody was settling down for lunch. So it was a perfect time to be torpedoed. The boat sunk in 30 seconds, just boom, gone. 59 of the 100, I think, men perished in the torpedoing. Dad was in his cabin, and he was flushed out, with the explosion, knocked unconscious, saved by one of his sailor mates, and taken to London Hospital and recovered a few days later. I think he was in a coma for a couple of days.
So probably remembered nothing of
Nope,
the
just boom, gone,
impact.
Hospital, yeah.
How lucky to have survived that.
Yeah, incredibly lucky. Yeah.
And you say he didn't talk much about it. Did he ever talk about or share stories about what his wartime experience was like?
Yeah,
And if so, do you remember any?
Well, the anecdotes would come out. He had medals. He had these 5 medals and the ribbons and so on. And he had a miniature set that he would wear in a tuxedo when they went to, Navy functions, usually around Remembrance Day annually. And so I can remember as a kid growing up, well, what are those all about? And one of the interesting stories there is, I said, those medals are phenomenal. What'd you get them for? He says, those were mostly for turning up. But he said, this one, and it's a little oak cluster, just a little thing on the ribbon. He said, that's the most important. He said, that was for being mentioned in dispatches, and they shot down a Junkers 44, a German plane, just after D-Day, which was pretty neat for a little Alberni Corvette.
Yeah, that would have been something that would have been talked about, obviously.
Yeah, well, it was. That's what the dispatches.
Very cool. Now, Jeff, I know I learned you're a commercial diver, and there was some. Tell us the story about how you began researching what happened on the Alberni.
Well, we were always fascinated. We didn't know much about it because we didn't hear a lot about it. In fact, we didn't really find out much about what the story was until after his death. However, he always took a great interest in what I was doing in diving, especially when I was diving on a Navy shipwreck. He would ask a lot of questions. So we had a connection on that. And it kind of drove me to the desire to try and find the wreck. And so we researched it a lot because the information that came out about how it went down was quite fascinating as well, because it was sunk by a German U-boat. It was the very first of its kind to have it was called a stealth sub, or Albright, which was a rubber coating that nobody knew about in the war at the time. As a result, it was very successful in sinking, I think it was 5 vessels, or 4 vessels within 5 days.
Because it was undetectable, is that it was very difficult for radar of the time, or whatever technology, sonar, I guess, at the time, to detect it.
Correct, because and nobody knew about this technology, and it just had been successfully implemented on this sub. As a result, it was sitting on the seabed in the Isle of Wight in the shipping channel. The Alberni was out on patrol, a regular day, and the submarine came up and took them out with an acoustic torpedo with no signature reading of the ASDEC at the time. The response to that was immediately for the military to send out a minesweeper, because that was the assumption of what had sunk the Alberni, and it too was sunk by the U-480 the next day, which was the submarine that sank the Alberni, and it went on to sink several. So until the documents were declassified, nobody was aware, none of the public were aware of this, which we started to research and understand. And so our interest was to go into the English Channel, figure out where the Alberni was, identify it, and then look for the other vessels surrounding it. But of course, it's a major shipping channel, logistically very challenging to do. But it started to uncover all of the stories which were fascinating, including the story of the U-boat captain, because they were the same age, 24,
Amazing.
26
So young.
years old.
Yeah.
And in war, fighting each other at this, at this young age, in command of their own vessels. So quite fascinating.
When he related his experience to, did you hear sort of secondhand through friends? How did you learn about what he went through, and how did that manifest itself in his sort of civilian family life? Was he scarred by what he lived through?
Never heard anything bad. It was a horrible time, and losing all those comrades, horrible. But never sort of whining about anything. Just on we go. The U-boat hull wasn't discovered until 1997.
Really?
Yeah.
So it wasn't until then that they figured
there's that
out.
gap from 1944 to 1997. Nobody really knew what this Albright technology was all about. And when they found the U-boat covered with this rubber, they put it all together. And Albright was a character out of a Wagner opera. It was invisible. And they got their transmission out, which was intercepted by the Allies, that Albright is working. And they kind of went, well, I wonder what that means. And
but there is a record of them being notified, but just didn't understand the context of it.
Exactly.
Wow.
So the Allies didn't know what to do, so they moved the shipping lane and they mined the old shipping lane. And the U-boat went back to Norway, reloaded, refueled, came back to, shoot some more ships down, and went right into a mine and sunk. So it wasn't very long after the Alberni that it sunk.
And was that the one and only that had that
No,
rubber
it was
coating?
it was the first of many.
And obviously the Germans would have seen how successful
Oh,
it
yeah.
was.
Yeah.
Let's
Well,
make more of these.
And this was August, he sank August 21st, 1944. So
44.
Okay,
nearing-
near the
Yeah,
end.
nearing
the
the
end.
end, yeah.
And actually, since then, it hasn't been replicated except early after the war as a technology to use. But the submarine, and to my dad's point, was discovered in 1997. So up until that point, which, you know, my grandfather passed away in 2001, up until that point, he didn't even know the full story of what had happened.
But then learned prior to his passing?
We found some correspondence that he found out near the end of his life, but imagine not knowing. What do we miss, you know?
Yeah, what
Who was
did we
on
miss?
sonar?
Who-
What-
But then it all makes, I'm sure, and I hope
Well,
that
I never know because we never had that discussion.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I guess we'll be left to wonder how he felt about that. But that had to be some comfort that they were playing against a stacked deck in that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Is there? What do you remember best about your granddad? Did you get a chance to
I did.
hang out with him?
Yeah, I did. I did actually, and he was really a strong, silent type. Is the best way to describe him. His successes were, humble. He remained humble. I felt about his successes. He was inspiring, during his lifetime, but more after. I think is really what reminds you about the things and time you need to spend with people to know who they are and what they've accomplished when they're alive, because you can appreciate what they've been through a lot more. And I think you can learn, myself, you learn a lot about what they've been through to help your life move ahead. And that's why it's important to keep the memory alive and the stories within our family anyways, without my kids and beyond, that this is a sacrifice that they went through, not only in the war, but after.
Yeah. When you think about this project and the desire to preserve the legacy of men like your father and your grandfather, what do you hope people take away from it when they watch this?
I don't know how to step up. I guess is one of the things that hits me. How to get involved and step up. I can't do a better job than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and don't be afraid of the challenges. I mean, you have to remember what they faced is way greater than anything we've faced in our generation because of what they did. So I would say the same thing is step up to the challenges ahead of you and not be deterred by it.
I think, as we've mentioned before in doing these interviews, context for what they went through provides context for our lives, and to be grateful for the sacrifices they made, and to understand a little bit more that maybe we got it pretty good thanks to
Absolutely.
thanks to their effort. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
Really appreciate it, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.
Okay.
That was great.
Michael Jack Brown.
Thank you very much. And who are you here to discuss today? These legends, these soldiers that have contributed so greatly to Canada.
3 family members. My dad, who I obviously know the best of them, he ended up a lieutenant colonel. My grandfather, who was one of the few Canadians to put on a uniform and go overseas in both wars. And my uncle, my grandfather ended up being a colonel. And my uncle, Malcolm Brown, who was driving a scout car in Italy as a captain when his scout car blew up and rolled down a hillside. All 3 of them were badly injured. My dad lost his eye. My uncle lost use of his legs, and my grandfather had most of his jaw shot off.
That's incredible. Let's go in. Let's sort of do it in an order if we can. It'll help as we sort of put these stories together. Why don't we start with your grandfather and sort of the early combat experience? First of all, what do you remember about it? How did you learn about it? What were your thoughts when you first kind of realized what your grandfather had done.
Obviously, it wasn't. I'm a pre-war baby, so I didn't know my grandfather until he came home, which was 1946. I was unaware that he had been wounded in the First War. His job in the Second War, he was working with my father at the investment firm Odlum Brown, which he co-founded with Major General Victor Odlum in the mid-20s. In fact, the Odlum Brown just celebrated its 100th, celebrated its 100th anniversary, but there was a serious interregnum. My father and my grandfather were both involved in military reserve, and when the war came, they were called up. They're both called up, and they had to decide what they do with their investment firm. They liquidated it. It ceased to exist, which is some sign of the sacrifices they were prepared to make. My grandfather was asked by the Canadian Army to go and run the Canadian Army Records Office in London. So he was not in active combat in the Second War, but he knew where every Canadian soldier, Army soldier, was all through the war. He kept the record. He had to sign every promotion that went out. Now, he didn't authorize any promotions. He just had to sign it as an administrative capacity. And he signed my uncle's promotion from captain to major. And while it was being sent to my uncle, his scout car rolled down the hillside and he never got it, the promotion. He signed my father's promotion from major to lieutenant colonel, sent it, and my father was wounded before he got it. He became a lieutenant colonel only later on, after he'd come out of hospital, trying to save, looking after his eye.
I look at that and I think of how important record keeping is through the lens of a project like this, or across the board when we want to know and learn about what Canadian soldiers did, where they did it, who was in what role. That might not be a combat role, but it certainly goes unheralded, but to think of how important that job was, you still must be very proud.
Well, yeah. And you think about, I was a few months old. It's August 1939. My dad gets a call at 4:30 in the morning. You got a report, and as he wrote in his autobiography for his family, he was then in the Army until he was demobbed in 1946. So my mother's English. She's 26. She's been in Canada for about a year and a half. What does father say to mother? What does grandfather say to my grandma? I mean, he was 51. Granny was 50. What do they say? We're going overseas? You might never see us again. We've closed up the firm. We don't know. And
it's hard for this generation to imagine.
I can't even imagine doing it myself. And I was supposed to be able to do that because that was the training I had. So my only way to understand what they did was to say, what if I was in their shoes? What would people do today? And this is a very important part of the project that we're a part of, and is to understand those kinds of sacrifices, a financial sacrifice and a family sacrifice. So my dad had seen me for 6 months. He might never see me again. His son might never know his father. Now, to begin with, my dad was the Irish Fusiliers Regiment, where they had joined us in the reserves. Didn't see overseas duty until 1943 or so. And he spent some time in Prince Rupert. I'm told that the Irish Fusiliers had to the West Coast was kind of the thing they did. And so before my father went overseas, my brother and sister were born in 1943. And father was away. Just as a sign of the sacrifice, my mother had no family support because her whole family support was my grandmother. My mother and my grandmother didn't actually get on very well. So she's 26 and she comes from a completely different culture. It's not as if she was born here and knew how, Canada worked. And so she has my brother and sister, and she had a stroke.
Oh my.
And my dad was on service somewhere. I think he was in Nanaimo by that stage. And he hears about it by telegram. So he was able to get my mother stabilized, but in the meantime, he knew that he couldn't decide where he was going to go. And before she was stabilized, he was sent off to Jamaica to a staff course. And so that's the kind of thing that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
But, when I look back, there are a lot of my dad's compatriots who never came home. They'd all said the same thing, something like this, to their wives. They had to close up their businesses. There were lawyers and accountants, other people in the investment business. Some never made it home. Some made it home in ghastly shape. So one of them was a guy called Tony Zaitsev, who was a fraternity brother of my father's at UBC in the 30s. Mm-hmm. He went to Hong Kong. Tony was one of the few who got back. So, and I knew his daughter, Anne. And we talked about this a little bit, what it was like to have a father who had come back and was so damaged that they basically couldn't function very well. Mm-hmm. So the sacrifices were not nominal. The sacrifices made a huge difference to the way they lived their life. Now, my dad lost his eye, which was bad enough. And eventually he got macular degeneration in the other eye. So, by the time he passed away, he was 93 when he died. By the time he passed away, he was functionally blind. I don't think the macular degeneration had anything to do with the war, but he only had one eye left. Mm-hmm. So there was a continuation of these sacrifices. There were funny jokes my father used to tell me about how he'd go through the metal detectors at the airports, and they would detect the shrapnel that was still in his legs. He had to have a letter explaining that this is why he there was no point stripping down because it was in his legs.
Yeah, you're not.
It used to come out once in a while. He'd see a piece of steel sticking out of his leg, and he'd pull it out with a pair of tweezers.
Wow.
And it would migrate. Right? They knew where it was, and he'd find it in some other part of his leg.
That this sense of duty and commitment to community to fill a role that needs to be filled regardless of whether it's easy or regardless of whether you are qualified for it or not, you just did what you had to do. It seems to be universal in the people that we've spoken to through this project, that there's a stoicism and a bravery to that doesn't get acknowledged enough.
I think so. Two of the things about which he was most proud was he was on the Vancouver Public Library. Mm-hmm. In fact, I believe the plaque is still there at the corner of Burrard and Robson. That was the main branch of the library before they built the one on Georgia Street. I don't think he was the chair, but his name's on the plaque. He knew nothing about libraries. He was on the Vancouver Police Commission for he knew nothing about police. He learned it all on the job. He was very proud of those. Now, there was one he did, which was the Order Commission on Banking and Finance, where he knew something. And he was happy to do that. It took a lot of his time and effort in the early 60s. But that was a business-oriented adventure. But it had a social purpose. They actually changed the way the banks work in this country. And they never had to have another banking commission because I read the thing. It was pretty goddamn boring, I gotta tell you. But at least to me, the people were kind of, you were asked to do it and you did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you think about the values and qualities that were in your grandfather and your father and your uncle as well, you know, how does it make you feel when you think of them and what they accomplished, not just in the war, but what they were able to accomplish after it too?
Well, as a son, it's impossible to avoid the culture that your father espouses. And so my brother is one of the most stoic people I know. He's a twin. My brother and sister were born 1943. And he probably exemplifies this better than anybody. He's got multiple illnesses. You talk to him on the phone and you think he's perfectly okay. And then you realize that he's got all these physical ailments, but it's his stoicism and his willingness to face adversity that just astounded me. And that came from my dad, for sure. My brother didn't know my grandfather so well, but he certainly, my father was able to get all three of us, I think, to observe the way that he lived his life. And without telling us what to do, he made it obvious what we should do.
They didn't, you know, in any way brag or you know, really talk about what they went through, but when they got back to civilian life and raised children and did those things, that it was their actions more than anything that influenced the people that followed.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's true. And of course I worked with my dad for a few years after I came back from college in England. So I could see both he and my grandfather, how they worked and how they worked together. Now my grandfather by that time was in his 60s and was kind of, he was on the downhill actually. And he wasn't particularly active in the way the firm was working. It was my dad who basically built the firm up. And I watched him do that. And I left after I'd been there for about 5 or 6 years because I wanted to be like him.
The things that you know and learned about your grandfather, that you know about your father and your uncle, why do you think it's important for us to preserve their experiences and memories?
And saying to young people, suppose you were WT in 1939 and your wife wakes up at 8 or 9 o'clock and you say, I've just been called up. Here's what I got to do. Here's where I'm going. And they accepted. My father accepted that, and he had to persuade my mother, of the purpose of what they were about to do. And I think that the kinds of sacrifice which they made, anticipating the kind of sacrifices they were about to perhaps make, is something that's missing today.
You and from all the people we've interviewed, that selflessness and sacrifice is what made Canada special.
Yeah.
And I think continues to.
We all make a social pact when we become citizens or inhabitants or residents of a place. We have all made a social pact. And the social pact has to do with the premise that even if we're looking at it selfishly, we're all better off if everybody else is okay. And I think that I never spoke to my father about what he had to say to Mother or how he justified going overseas. We never talked about it. Maybe we should have. We didn't. But it was part of the social contract. They believed that as a part of us. I think maybe I'm putting words in their head. But I believe that they felt that part of this responsibility of a citizen is to care about the well-being of the rest of them. And that's, there's a certain segment of the political sphere that doesn't believe in that. And I think that's very unfortunate.
I want to thank you again for your time. I'm so sorry. If we're cutting it short, I have to be on a call at 11 o'clock. I'm a minute late for it, but I loved everything you had to say about this, Mike. Just say your full name.
Curtis Clark.
Yeah. And yours?
Benj Clark.
Benj or Benjamin?
Yeah, Benj.
Always good to have the younger generation here too. Obviously the stories have been passed down a little bit too, but tell me, first I'll start with you, Benjamin. What do you remember hearing? What's your first, earliest memory of Brigadier General Robert Percy Clark, and what are those stories and memories like?
Okay, well, I know I look really old, but he died in 1932.
Yeah.
So I never actually met him. So what I know about him is just through books and newspaper articles, and from my uncles and aunts and father.
And what did they tell you about him? What are your?
quite a
That's
lot.
I knew you weren't around.
Yeah,
Just so you know. But just trying to get a sense of what you know about him
Yeah.
and what you heard about
Well,
him.
he was quite a character. So he had a really varied career. He went to the Klondike Gold Rush. He went by the Edmonton-Dawson route, which was really, really difficult. A couple of thousand tried it, and only about 160 actually made it. He prospected for gold. He mined for gold. When that went dry, he delivered mail by dog sled from Dawson to Circle City, Alaska. When the Boer War broke out, he enlisted, went with the Royal Fusiliers to South Africa and fought there. He fought with the Royal Fusiliers, the Kimberley Light Horse, and the Rand Rifles. On April 17th, 1901, he was wounded in a battle with Boer commandos in northern Transvaal at Merritt, and he was shot through the left forearm, and that wound paralyzed his fingers. And he won the Queen's Medal for South Africa with 3 bars, and the King's Medal from South Africa with 2 bars. And then after the war, he came to BC. He had a wide career. He was a real estate salesman. He sold automobiles. He was a stockbroker, and he had various other careers. Then when the war broke out, he was with the BC Regiment, 7th Battalion. He was a captain. He's with the 1st Canadians that entered the war, landed in France in 1915, and immediately they went into the 2nd Battle of Ypres, where gas was used for the first time. So he suffered from mustard gas and that attack. And he won a military cross for gallant action at the 2nd Battle of Ypres. And then he was promoted to a major, and then fought, or is then promoted to 1916, lieutenant colonel of the Royal Montreal Regiment, 11th Battalion. And he fought at the Battle of the Somme, which was maybe the worst battle ever fought in history. That was a 4-month battle. Well, actually 4 months, 2 weeks, 3 days, from July 1st to November 18th. And at that battle, he was wounded. He was, a shell exploded and embedded his leg with shrapnel. That was on November 4th, 1916. So that was
Wow.
yeah. Anyway, after the Battle of the Somme, he was put in charge of the East Ontario Regiment, 11th Battalion, I think, and he led them in battles in Flanders.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 1918, he was promoted to Brigadier General put in charge of the 2nd Infantry Brigade, and he led that brigade in the famous 100 days of Canada's advance into Germany, breaking the Hindenburg Line. And the last day of the war, I should also mention he fought at Vimy Ridge as well. And the last day of the war, they captured, along with the Canadian Army, the village of Mons in Belgium. And so they marched through the streets there to
Great
cheers
fanfare and cheers,
yeah.
yeah.
And he was leading the infantry. And they was aside at November 11th, the last guy to die in the war was Canadian. He was Private George Price, and he died at 10:58, 2 minutes before 11 o'clock, before the armistice.
Wow.
That's when he was killed. Anyway, that was his military career.
And I mean, that's an amazing run, being in some of the most crucial battles in that conflict. What was it like, if you can go back to his connection to the Vancouver club? Was he
Sure.
At what point did he get engaged here? And
Yeah, in fact, there's a plaque on the walls of, it's the second floor, Curtis?
A menu on the second floor.
Of a dinner held to commemorate the landing of the first Canadian troops to France in 1915. The dinner was for the BC officers who were with that contingent, and it was hosted, it says on the plaque, by Brigadier General R.P. Clark and Brigadier General V.W. Odlum. I always want to say Odlum Brown, but you know.
Yeah, it's the original, it's before that.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
And Curtis, let me ask you, when you hear that rundown of the experiences of your
great-grandfather,
the detail that your dad has gone into, and you hear about his life and his experiences, what do you think about him, and what place does he hold in your life?
I think it's pretty, makes me seem very unaccomplished, I guess, but
makes all of us feel that way. Don't worry, Curtis.
But it's pretty amazing, and you kind of grow up hearing, and in school and stuff, you learn about the Somme and Ypres and Vimy, and to have someone in our family that was a part of that and that kind of rose through the ranks during all of that is, something I think to be proud of. And we grew up with pictures of him and of my grandfather in the house, and unfortunately I didn't get to meet any of them, but just seeing pictures of them and the recognition for the sacrifice that they've made as well. I think my dad has a photo of my great-grandfather's funeral, for example, right? And the amount of support, I guess, that came out for them, I think is pretty amazing. So, yeah.
And as a younger man, you look at, as I do, you look at the sort of the dedication and the sacrifice that some of these guys made. When it's someone in your own family, how does it make you feel about him?
It's pretty amazing, and I feel proud of that. I haven't even been in a job for more than 3 years without changing, so just the fact that they stuck it through, and the amount, the things they must have seen and the things they must have gone through would be not something I would necessarily want to experience, right? So it's pretty amazing that there's people that do and that did and helped make Canada and the club and all of that what it is today too. So, yeah.
It's pretty special. Now, I'm almost hesitant to ask about your dad, because if you know so much about your grandpa, I can imagine what you know about your dad.
I'll try not to bore you.
Yeah, no, it's all fascinating stuff. But give us a rundown of his experience and sort of the place that he plays in your own personal history and in Canada's.
Well, he was a member of this club, and he used it a lot. He was with the Duke of Connaught's own rifles before the war. And in 1939, he enlisted with the PPCLI, the famous regiment.
Princess Patricia's Canadian Light
Infantry. And went overseas. It was pretty unique because his whole family enlisted. So he had a older sister, Lieutenant Enid Clark, who served with the Canadian Women's Army. And he had an older brother, Bobby Clark, who was a colonel with the Irish Regiment, fought in Italy, got DSO. He had a brother, Lieutenant Bruce Clark, fought with the Princess Louise Dragoons and died in a plane crash during the war. He had his youngest brother, Ted Clark, was a sergeant with the Three Rivers Regiment. He died at the age of 23 of wounds sustained in battle at the Battle of Cassino in Italy. His wife, who was from here, from Vancouver, but enlisted with the Fannies, and she was drove an ambulance with the Polish Army in exile in Scotland. So they married in 1941 in England, a military wedding. So she was also involved in the war effort. So it was a
real shared experience for all of them, but a total commitment from the family. That sense of values obviously is universal among that group.
Yeah. And then he was with the PPCLI when they invaded Sicily. He was a captain of A Company with the PPCLI. And during that battle, Gordon Smith, I don't know, the artist, he's got a painting downstairs here on
in the Georgian Room.
Georgian Room.
Yeah.
He was a good friend of my father, and he got wounded in Battle of Lefonte in Sicily. And then he was with the troops and they invaded Italy. He was a major, he was promoted to major with the Edmonton Regiment, the Eddies, when they fought in the Battle of Ortona. And that's one of the most famous battles in Canadian military history. It was called Canada's Stalingrad because it was fought from house to house, room to room, attic to cellar. It was small arms conflict, and you
hand-to-hand combat.
Hand-to-hand combat.
Wow,
you saw the eyes of the guys you were fighting against. And we talk about the sacrifice these guys made and the fear and anxiety and hardships they went through. But we sometimes forget that they killed people, and at close range where you could see in the eyes, and they were well aware that these guys were just soldiers like them. They just had another uniform.
Yeah.
And I think that affected them mentally. I'm sure it did. I don't know. My father never liked that generation, never talked about it, but I'm sure it did. And anyway, during the battles in Italy, the colonel of the PPCLI was wounded, and my father took over command of the regiment on the battlefield. And he led the regiment the rest of their campaign through Italy. And then they were transferred to Northwest Europe, and he led the battalion into the Netherlands. And he was the first soldier to enter Amsterdam on May 7th and accept the surrender of the Germans.
Wow.
In that city.
A moment in history.
It's in Wikipedia.
Yeah.
It
must be true.
It must be true.
Yeah.
So he accepted their surrender, and then a street's named after him in Holland, in Bloomingdale, Colonel Clarkland, which I believe you've seen.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it, but then he came back to. after the war, he was put in command of the Winnipeg Rifles, the chosen frozen, sort of fits Winnipeg. And he was put in charge of guarding Brigadier Fuhrer Kurt Meyer, who was the highest ranking German officer as a prisoner of war for war crimes. And he was in charge of guarding him for 3 weeks. And then came back to Vancouver after demobilization. He was president of the PPCLI Association in Vancouver and kept in touch with them, and an executive with BC Sugar Refinery. And,
able to get back into civilian life, and you know, despite all the scars physically and mentally, I'm sure that you had to deal with. Curtis, I want to go back to the story your dad told about you being there to see this street named after your grandfather. What was it? Tell me just a little bit about that trip and what it was like to see that.
My aunt had gone the previous year, I believe, and she met with the mayor of Bloomingdale, I guess, and so my brothers and my mom and I decided to go and see it as well. And it's pretty interesting that it's in an area where all the streets are named after Canadian, US, or British soldiers. So it's, you know, there's lots of English names, I guess, and it's not a big street or anything. It's kind of a lane, but it's pretty cool to see. It's pretty amazing to see his name there. And then under it, there's a description of why, I guess, his name is there, and that he was the first Allied soldier in occupied Holland. So it's pretty amazing that that's part of Holland's history, our history. Yeah, it was really moving to be there.
I bet, quite a moment to see that.
Yeah, definitely.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
There was a ship that came into Vancouver Harbor, the SS Limburg, from Holland in 1946, and they invited Reg Clark on board because they had a big appreciation set up on the wall of the cabin, saying in eternal gratitude to PPCLI and under Lieutenant Colonel R.P. Clark for freeing us from the oppressor.
That's incredible.
So,
proud, another proud moment, I'm sure, when that happened.
This is at the corner of Burrard and Georgia, and
I mean, that's a full-on
that was
Victory Day parade style parade.
Right, yeah.
What's the church there? The cathedral? Christchurch.
Christchurch Cathedral.
So it was there, and then they had the
streets lined like 10 deep.
Yeah.
See, that's pretty
and there.
unusual, I guess, right? So
Indicative of the respect
exactly
that people had for him.
But it's interesting that he wanted to be buried with the common soldiers, the soldiers' plot. So he's in Mountain View Cemetery in the military section in northwest between 33rd and 31st along Prince Edward, the Horn section. And that's his grave. And if you walk down there, which I've done a few times, you're walking down through rows and rows, and it's like private, corporal, sapper, corporal, brigadier general, private.
Wow.
So it's
and he's where he wanted to be.
That's where he wanted
I
to
look
be.
forward to that being open again because, as you know, it's been under, like, what is it, 5 or 6 years now?
It's ages.
Like, come on, guys.
Yeah.
Let's get this wrapped up.
Just a dirt pit now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing those photos and your stories, guys. I appreciate it.
My name is Donald Ross Clark. C-L-A-R-K is the last name.
No E. And are you okay to be referred to as, do you like Donald or are you Ross? Ross is it. Okay. So, first of all, tell us who you are. Who are you here to share stories about?
Well, I'm now an honorary member of the club. I'm past president and was a member for, 30 years. My father was a member as long as I knew him, and my grandfather was one of the very early members of the club, and till he died.
And who's your grandfather?
General John Arthur Clark.
And your
Father was Donald McGilvery Clark.
Gotcha.
And my mother was also a past president of the club.
Oh wow! So there's quite
As was my grandfather.
quite a connection
Yeah.
here. Let's talk first about wartime and their contributions that way. What I know nobody likes to talk about it, or they certainly didn't, but you were able to learn some things sort of secondhand afterwards. So what do you know? What do you remember? What are your earliest memories of kind of
I think
those things?
my grandfather and I did not have a close relationship. He had 18 grandchildren, and I was one of many, and not in his top echelon, which is fine. But he was a remarkable man. None of the family, my father or grandfather, ever discussed the war and wouldn't. And I've seen my father shut down social conversations where it came up with his friends. He wouldn't have anything to do with it. But when my mother passed away, my brother and I were cleaning out the house, and I found newsletters about my grandfather, which actually really surprised me. They did it in this way. I had noted that people who had served under him were incredibly respectful of him. They revered him. I didn't know why, because it was never explained, but they did. So when we were going through all these old papers, one of the things I came across, or a few of these, were these sort of newsletters that they would circulate to the troops during the First War. This is my grandfather. And they, for example, they dealt with his role in Vimy. He was serving under Arthur Currie, the general, Canadian general, who was a great, probably the greatest general of the First War. But when they were given that challenge of taking Vimy, you remember, I don't think the Allies had won anything. It was just a war of attrition, back and forth, going nowhere, just killing people. And they developed what came to be known as the moving barrage, and they had their men rehearse it before the battle started. So that was the first thing that really made a difference in this battle, because when they went, they would have the barrage take place. What the Germans didn't know was that the troops were 50 yards or whatever it was right behind the assault. Right. And so when they came out of their trenches, or out of where they were hiding, they were met by guns right in the face, and that was the end of that. One of the stories that I read about, and I don't have the papers anymore, but they are at the Seaforth Armory, was that my grandfather got his orders for whatever the group was called was supposed to do in the war. And I think he had 1,000 men under him for that attack. And he decided he only needed half of them. So he left half his men in a place of safety. And then he did everything he was assigned to do and ended up at the top with the other half, which reduced his casualties by an immense amount because they were never even on the firing line. And one of the stories there was that they had to restrain him. He was starting to run after the Germans with his pistol.
That's commitment.
That's adrenaline.
Yeah.
Let's see, another story was, I think it was at Passchendaele. No, this was early on when he was a captain or something. He got orders to go in and hold a trench that the Australians had just taken from the Germans. And he looked at it and he didn't like it. And I found this incredibly, showed a side of him I had never been aware of. But he has his orders, he's got to hold this trench. So what he did was he took his men up there and they dug a new trench in front of the old trench. Because he figured that if there was a single trench on that battlefield the Germans knew the location of, was the one they were just thrown out of.
Good point.
So the next morning, the original trench is gone, and most of his men are completely uninjured in the trench that they dug in front.
So tactically, he had a very brilliant mind.
He had an incredible mind, and he got the order again. Same kind of order, and he went up this time and he did it twice as far. So he had no casualties, nothing, nobody was wounded.
That's incredible.
And he, at Passchendaele, I think it was, I'm quite sure it was Passchendaele, because my memory for places and things has never been very good. But this was one of the last 3 attacks of battles of the war. Currie won 3 battles in a row in 90 days in that war, which in itself is an incredible achievement for a single general to master.
That's why his name is everywhere.
And it should be.
Yeah.
It should be. He's remarkable. But what on this one, they had assigned my grandfather's group to be leading some part of the assault, and my grandfather always went up into the front, right to the front of the lines, right to the front trenches. He wasn't back 30 miles away directing things. He was right there. And on this occasion, he went and looked at the ground, and their line of attack was right through a swamp. They were waist deep in mud and slop. And he reported this back, presumably to General Currie, and they had to completely change the assault to one that was on paper not as attractive, but if they got into that swamp, the people would all be killed.
Right.
So that's another example of how he would tend to, they were thinking out of the box. I think the Canadians were thinking out of the box because they became very much the army that Haig was relying upon to win these battles.
And they did a great job.
The
with
Canadian Army, yeah.
With your grandfather in a leadership
very
position.
Much so. So he went from, I don't know, lieutenant or captain at the beginning to a brigadier general when the war ended in the field.
When you realized this about your grandfather, you mentioned the relationship was, there wasn't much to it when you were a kid, but when you finally read some of this stuff and realized what an impact he had, how did you feel about it?
I admire him. I mean, my view of him through life would have been very different had I had any idea what they had accomplished. And now I fully understand why the men revered him. They're still alive, the ones that came back home. And one of the reasons was that kind of leadership. And that's just, it's a good feeling.
It sounds like you have a unique perspective on why it's important to save these stories and memories.
Well, I got history. All I got from history was dates, places, and events, but none of it made any magical sense. When I see in history what my grandfather did, what they accomplished, I mean, they won Vimy Ridge, they took it, and they became the go-to army in the First War. They're the guys, they were the frontline people. But why? And the reason why is because they were so good.
Yeah.
And they weren't constrained by all these other stupid rules. It was a remarkable accomplishment in my mind.
Part of this, obviously, is bringing a connection back to civilian life and a connection to Vancouver, the Vancouver Club, and how he contributed to society when it was all over, too.
He did, because he came home and he returned to Vancouver. He decided to run for Parliament and was very active in Parliament in support of veterans and the armed forces.
He always had his men on his mind, it sounded like.
Always, yeah. He decided, as I say, he was in Parliament, he served 2 terms in Parliament. He decided he couldn't afford to continue doing that, and he came back to Vancouver and started practicing law as a barrister primarily. When my father returned from the Second War, he got my grandfather and a couple of other lawyers, one that was associated with my grandfather and another one, and they formed Clark Wilson, White, Clark, and McGuire as a partnership. And that's now the current Clark Wilson firm.
Gotcha.
So the 2 of them were in that firm for certainly up until my grandfather passed, because he never retired.
Yeah, worked right till the end.
And he came to the office as long as he could. Anyways, he going back again, he served Parliament. He went into the Canadian. He was active as a lawyer. He was King's Counsel. He was elected president of the Canadian Bar Association in about 1952. This was not long after my father had got the firm going. Mm-hmm. And in classic, I mean, this was just absolutely classic of what my grandfather would do. He stood up at his inaugural address to the Canadian Bar Association and announced that all the judges were a bunch of political hacks and shouldn't be there in the first place.
Wow.
And weren't qualified, half of them weren't qualified to do what they were doing, which apparently was a bit of a constant refrain of his whenever he appeared before anybody.
That would have been controversial at
Yeah,
the time.
well,
I'm
Dad,
sure,
Dad thought that was the end of the firm.
turned out not to be the case.
No, it wasn't the case. He was fine.
That's a good jumping off point to talk about your dad, who also.
So my grandfather, didn't do anything quietly. He was stormy, but there is a rumor in the family that he was invited into the Order of Canada and declined it.
Really?
Yes, because he didn't want to be associated with many of the people who'd already received it. And all I can say is, if he were reviewing the current nominees and people going in, he would be glad he made the decision he did, if it was true. I mean, all I know is a rumor. He had presence.
Yeah.
Tremendous presence. So that gives you some, he was a character.
Yeah, was he ever?
My father was a softer version, but very successful. But I just know he landed in the toe of Italy. He fought up past Monte Carlo, spent most of his war in Italy, and then was called back to England, and he went to Holland for a while. I think he was in Amsterdam administering or something before he came home. He met my mother there, and they got married during the war. And
was she was Belgian then?
No, he met them in England because
Gotcha.
Turns out that my other grandfather, who was also a Seaforth in the First War, served under my first the grandfather I was discussing. He was working in London at the time for Sarco. He was a mining engineer. This is in the 40s when my dad was there. So they happened that the Seaforths were billeted very close to where my mother's father lived with my mother, and so I'm here now.
Some dance, some dance, or
some event.
Some event.
Because the second grandfather would entertain the troops quite regularly.
Yeah.
And they actually had their house bombed out.
Really? Oh, that's another brush with death. That,
yes.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Did your dad ever talk about his experience at all?
No, he would not discuss it, and he would shut down any discussion of it. I mean, aggressively. So I have no idea. I don't have any insight into what he did, and I've not seen any publications or anything that would.
You know more about your grandfather's service.
I know way
really.
more about my grandfather. I just, I know he also moved up the ranks and did very well by the time he left the war, but that's all I know.
Was he a member here
yes,
as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
he was on the Vancouver Foundation, Children's Hospital boards, and did a lot of public service.
Yeah, a lot of public, and that I think is again universal when we talk about some of these guys who went off to war and then felt a deep commitment to the community and to continue being connected, and public service was a big part of it.
That's right.
And obviously you share a lot of those values because you're here being a part of this.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your
I got
stories.
another one for you. Bert Blair.
Of course.
Bert Blair is an indirect uncle of mine. He married my father's mother's sister, and he was in the First War. I believe, yes, he was a Seaforth. Mm-hmm. And one of the competitions that they had in England was the Bisley and King's Trophy, two separate competitions for marksmanship.
Okay.
As far as I know, he's still the only person who's won them both.
Wow.
And he's very much, the old Lee Enfield rifle that he used is in the officer's mess at the Seaforths.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And so did you hear indirectly about his contributions?
No, we knew, the family knew about that.
Family knew about that, yeah.
That part, yes, definitely. And he, as I understand it, was also instrumental in acquiring the land from the natives for the Seaforth Armory. And he worked with my grandfather in getting it built. My grandfather did work the political end, and he got the mechanics of it done.
Wow, what a legacy, because that still stands like a sentinel.
I know, and if it's actually, they have a museum there, And if you want an interesting history of Vancouver and people in Vancouver, it is rich. And the public can have access to it. You just need to phone the curator and talk to him. He'll give you times and places. They're very happy to assist.
How important do you feel it is for that kind of stuff to be preserved and shared?
I think it's critically important, and it distresses me to see us trying to change our history, because I don't think we have anything to be embarrassed about. I mean, I don't think the fact that John A. Macdonald drank in any way diminishes the greatness that he represents to our country and the wonderful things he did do. And I'm sure there were mistakes, but we've all made them.
That's wisdom.
When I graduated from law school, I did my articles at Clark Wilson and was there for 2 years, and he was coming to the office most days till after I accepted a position with Davis and Company. At that time, he was not intricately involved, and who knows? But he was also active. I mean, he did an appeal to Ottawa, to some pension appeal board for one of his families of one of his soldiers.
Oh, wow.
I mean, he was absolutely dedicated to that sort of stuff. It wouldn't surprise me he was active in the day-to-day stuff, but my impression is that my father was the one who was the driving force behind that partnership and really held it together and made it all work. And when I arrived there, I had an uncle who was there, Jack McGuire, who was a very, very good counsel, and Artie was not going to court on a regular basis anymore. But people like Dave Buchanan, who was there when I was there, he was a bit older, could regale you with stories about my grandfather and the things he would get up to. But I can't remember them well enough to retell them.
Sounds like he lived a fascinating life.
He did.
And I'm
He
glad.
did, very full.
I'm glad you were able to discover it in the way that you did and share it with
Well,
us.
so I'm grateful too. It was just by chance. I just saw this leaflet and I started, wonder. I couldn't understand why they kept it. Well, then I understood. And it's that sort of thing that history puts a life on history, because you realize we didn't just win Vimy Ridge, we won for reasons, and we won for reasons Canadians did. That army was remarkable. And you thank Curry, you thank the leadership, but you thank all the people to the bottom.
And you thank your grandfather.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's
Pleasure.
been great. It's
Yeah.
been a real pleasure to chat with
Pleasure.
you.
Yeah.
Just state your name.
Okay. Tim Brown.
And what's your connection to this project? Tell us about the person that you're here to speak about.
Well, I'm a third generation member of the Vancouver Club. My grandfather joined, I think, in the 57, 58. It's around that time anyway. Then my father joined, his son-in-law, and then I joined. My first memory of the club pretty much is with him here, because I wasn't allowed in until I was like 13. But when he wanted his birthday, at the circle table in the main dining room, and he wanted his 5-year-old grandson to show up, he just said, "I'm informing the club he's showing up." and I was seen but not heard. I stayed in like Church Mouse in a 3-piece suit, didn't move the entire dinner. I was afraid of my grandfather. But he was an imposing figure. And his name was Brigadier General Cuthbert Arnold Edwards.
That is amazing. And tell us a little bit about what you learned. Like, what's your earliest memory of what his war experience was like? These guys are notoriously reticent to speak about it, but what's your earliest memory of what you learned about him?
Probably, yes, he didn't talk much about it, but he did have 3 Lee Enfields in his house. And of course, as a young kid, we'd go by his house and babysitting and open a door and, what's that?
Yeah.
And so there's no bullets in the house, but they were his rifles, and so he told me about those. But then I actually brought his uniforms, and I remember seeing his uniforms, and he would show me things like that. He had no problem talking about the heraldry of war, but he didn't want to go into any details about his own experience.
Did you hear from friends or others that knew him? What are some of the earliest stories that you remember about his experience?
Well, one story that sticks out very much is he he was notoriously never late for anything. He was very regimented, very disciplined. And yet, in 1942 or 43, probably 42, he missed a Dakota flight from Cairo up to the front line. And everybody in that flight was shot down and died. And he doesn't miss flights. So my grandmother was apoplectic, and he was, wasn't in good communication, and yet he was on the next flight. But a Messerschmitt found the Dakota and took it down.
That is amazing and quite a stroke of luck considering
he never
a
missed,
lifetime of never missing
anything. No, exactly. Yeah.
That's incredible. When you think of him and his sacrifices during that time, what are your thoughts? There must be a sense of
Well, I brought a whole bunch of photo albums, and there's pictures of him in the desert. Some pictures are more with him and his wife in, up and down the Nile and up in what then was Palestine. Because he was stationed there before the war, and then he was 8th Army after during the war. I just know that he was just always disciplined. He was a lieutenant colonel during the war, brigadier general after, but he was in charge of the Royal Army Ordnance. And my father, who was born in 1930, too young to fight, but old enough to listen to all the propaganda and believed everything he thought. So he told me stories of how my grandfather's, he was a member of the King's Regiment, which is a very prestigious regiment, but he was so organized, they seconded him from there to the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, which is not as prestigious, but he did his job. He was the one who made sure the shells got to El Alamein. He's the one who made sure that all that happened. As Lieutenant Colonel, he's not front line, so I don't know any stories about him actually in battle and bullets flying around. But I know that, my grandmother didn't see him for long periods of time, and my mother was raised by essentially escaped Jews from Germany in Palestine, and so my mother grew up speaking German, and she didn't even, didn't even know her father for many years because he was not present. He was in the war, which I'm sure was consistent with many, many people. So it's not a big sacrifice, but it's, yeah.
Right, but fascinating that that sort of the flow and sort of, I guess, flexible borders and people moving around had a profound impact on your mom and on many other people.
There is a famous story that my mom told, but she wouldn't have known, is that in 43 or 44, when they got into a ship, left Cairo and went around Africa and back to England, so part of the, my grandfather, I don't think it was part of D-Day, but he was still, a lot of soldiers came home ready for anything.
What are your thoughts about us doing this project and being able to preserve some of the memories and stories of these guys?
I love this beyond words because I'm a history degree major. So I've got 2 of his uniforms. I've got his sword, I've got his hat, I've got 80 photos of him. I've got his birth certificate. I've got his father's birth certificate. I've got all this stuff because I love history and I have great memories. And obviously, most of my memories of my grandfather are post-war. But the whole idea of keeping this alive and bringing it forward to the next generations is huge. This is huge.
If you could sum up, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you could just sum up your feelings about your grandfather and his service in war and then the life he led afterwards, how do you feel about it?
Well, I don't know if I ever really saw him relax too much. But as I said, he was very disciplined, very organized, and those 2 words keep on coming back because they are the 2 words that. But he was fair, and best answers by a story. He had a business partner, and he had a shotgun clause, and he had to buy his business partner out, so he had to change the name of his company. So we went down and got some new checks in the name of the company, but it had 1984 in it, because the same company just wanted to add the new number. And we're driving back, and I look at this box of checks. I didn't know what a check was. I did. I knew what a check was at that point. And I said, Grandpa, I thought you said your company's name was 1984. There's no 1984 in this. He pulls the car over, stops, and goes, they completely messed it up. Good on you. Turned around and went back to the thing, and he gave them back the 2,000 checks that he had custom made and do it right. And he told everybody about how how I just asked a simple question and plotted some detail. And I've never felt so good about something that, he made such a big deal about something I thought was pretty simple. But he had missed it, and so he was very capable of giving appreciation. I think he respected people who put in a good day's shift. And he was a rock. He actually died in my arms in a nursing home. They rolled him over to do something, and he just looked up at me, and he passed away.
Wow.
He's 80. He was born in 1907 and passed away in 1995. He was a huge force.
Yeah. A big figure in your life.
Remember the movie Chariots of Fire?
Yeah.
So that was the 24 Olympics. My grandpa was born in 07. So for the 28 Olympics, at that point, he was a boxing, fencing, and track and field champion of the British Army. If you see some of the photos, this guy was just buff. I was a big disappointment for him that I wasn't as much of an athlete as he was, even though apparently I had his rib cage. So the story goes that in 28 or 27, he was doing the hurdles, and the guy who did the hurdles, that Viscount, a nobleman who won the 24 Olympic hurdles, he was going again. And so he raced my grandfather beat him. So they had to have another race, and he beat my grandpa. And they had to have another race, and he beat my grandpa. So he did not go to the 28 Olympics because that guy beat my grandpa. But all that story came out around Chariots of Fire, and that wasn't war. So my grandpa told me that story. But I don't remember all the details, but it was something along those lines. They raced together, and my grandfather eventually lost. But
did beat him in one race?
At least one race. And I'm not sure if it was the first or second or whatever, but not the third.
That is a brush with greatness, though, obviously.
Yeah, but
Very
I remember
cool.
that was a big to do.
Wow.
For us.
Well, thank you, Tim. Okay,
Wonderful.
thank you so much. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Tim.